Hello. In this presentation, I'm going to provide a general overview of the current practices in deaf education. I have this funny little old lady here to get us going. When addressing a serious subject, sometimes you gotta have a bit of levity. Throughout the decades that I have been involved in deaf education, I have witnessed many sad and distressing things. And when one is faced with these sad, infuriating, painful things, it's important to bring in some humor. So here we go. Some deaf folks speak. Some deaf folks sign. Often they are regulated exclusively to one of these separate camps. Yet don't we know many that do both? Society's expectation is that deaf children should be taught to learn to speak and hear. After all, the signing deaf community is very small in number. The hearing parents of the deaf child are pressured into choosing one or the other. What I'm hoping to do is to dismantle these binaries. It's not an either or. It can be both. By both, what do I mean? I mean incorporating the medical perspective of deaf education that focuses on the hearing loss with the deficit view regarding the impairment of hearing, as well as the cultural view that's proud of the deaf community's language and culture, that values a language that has been well researched and proven by scholars to be a real language, that values the advantage of having a community of others like oneself. I'm going to try to convince you why incorporating both perspectives is effective. If we want to eschew the binaries and incorporate both perspectives, we have to begin by updating current educational policies to reflect the latest research in language acquisition. Languages and language use are amazingly political. It's historically embedded into societal beliefs that specific languages are valued and others are to be marginalized. So we must begin by discussing our own attitudes towards languages and why they exist. Do you have these biases? The second major issue regarding deaf education is the fact that we are dealing with two different cultures. Though in reality, there could be 2, 3, 4 or more cultures at play in a classroom. Let me illustrate. Mainstream Hearing Society has its own culture. I live with my hearing husband. We have 2 hearing daughters. Their culture is different. While I did grow up in an all-hearing family, during my adult years, I was introduced to the deaf community and deaf culture, which I have adopted. It fits me. So I am constantly moving amongst the two. Some students I've worked with in the past have a third culture connected to their families, such as First Nations, new immigrants, or traditional ethnic backgrounds that are still practiced. So it's imperative to understand that deaf education is navigating the dynamics of a number of different cultures. The hearing majority tend to view deaf people as inferior because they have a different language, a different culture. Their English is often non-standard when speaking. So the majority insist the educational goal is to take measures to mitigate these deficits. What we need is for deaf education to respond to the language deprivation of students. How do the students come to the system with such deprivation? Perhaps you think that people who have the cochlear implant, CI, surgery, have their hearing restored. This is not true. After implantation, some sound sensations are transmitted to the brain, but they don't sound like what you hear. The brain has to reinterpret these sensations to recognize them. And a new life begins learning to understand spoken language when not everything said is captured by the CI. A great deal is missing. Because of all the missing auditory information, the brain is not able to construct meaningful language, hence language deprivation. Alternatively, the young child supported by a weak sign language model, someone whose vocabulary repertoire is limited and knowledge of the syntax is disfluent, that child too will suffer from language deprivation. A deaf child whose hearing is augmented such that they miss very little auditory input, or a child who has exposure to fluent sign language models and users, both these children are likely to acquire language in a normal, cognitively healthy, stage-wise progression. Language deprivation is a very serious problem in deaf education. Deaf education must recognize and deal with the inherent audiocentric privilege valued and imposed by people like you who are watching this presentation. You may not even realize the extent of this privilege. You can put on a radio and catch up on the latest. You hear every announcement in an airport. You can attend any lecture or presentation you wish, even last minute. You can listen to any conversation within earshot. And you assume the same is true for all those around you. That's why speech is the most important means of communication. Audiocentric privilege expects everyone must speak English. These are just a few identified privileges of hearing people. Conversation is defined as speaking, hearing, listening. Consider the audiocentric privileges you take for granted and how they bias against deaf people and infiltrate deaf education. I'll give you a specific example of when my husband demonstrated an audiocentric behavior. He comes over to me to say something, but I'm focused on something elsewhere in the room. He'll start speaking beside me, but I'm not looking at him. But he assumes I hear him. In order to be more deaf-centric, he should tap me on the shoulder, get my attention. Once we have eye contact, then he can say what he wishes. While he does know this, he forgets. His audiocentric upbringing takes over. This is a sign for autism. It's framing a box around the ear. Autism, like all other isms, is a form of discrimination against a group of people. Think of racism, actions that disadvantage and marginalize people of color. Attitudes we hold against the differences we perceive others to have from ourselves. Autistic attitudes manifest themselves in many different forms. For example, some people believe that sign language is not a real language. It's just waving the hands around, gesturing, monkey talk. It's a means of communication, but it's not really a language. This is not true. Decades of scholarly research by linguists have shown sign languages are indeed full-fledged languages equal to any spoken language. However, those with an autist view cannot fathom that the same level of linguistic complexity, technicality, or artistry can be communicated in a sign language, like it can be done in a spoken language. Audiocentric views put the primacy of spoken language over sign language. Autist views promote that even some speech, poor speech, which may not be understood by others outside the family, is better than excellent sign language skills. They view fluency in sign language as irrelevant and unnecessary. Audiocentric views put the primacy of spoken language over sign language. An autist assumes that interpreting skills are not necessary, as long as the appearance of access is met. We tried, after all. Hiring qualified interpreters with the requisite skills, experience is not necessary. The attitude is, well, something is better than nothing. You may remember the infamous story of the imposter interpreter in South Africa. Just made up movements and gestures throughout all the speeches. Organizers hired him thinking he was a competent interpreter without checking into his credentials or background, relying on his word alone, when in fact he had no facility in any of the local sign languages at all. The deaf community in South Africa complained at the service, complained that the organizers would employ such an imposter, and the outcry got global attention from many news organizations. But it's not just this instance. Our schools, boards of education, governments, and classroom teachers think that if they hire someone with a little bit of sign, that's better than nothing. This audiocentric privilege appeases us by providing the illusion of access at the expense of the child's language development. They perceive sign language as inferior and easy to learn, so the unskilled interpreter can catch up. But it's a language, so it's not easy to learn. The autist perspective looks at the fact that deaf people come together in community as negative, that they are ghettoized. It's because they can't function in the hearing world, which is completely false. Where else do we live except in the hearing world? Look at me. I have a hearing husband, hearing daughters, I have hearing friends and colleagues. My siblings and parents are hearing. My nieces and nephews are hearing. The same is true for other deaf people. We are not living in a ghetto. We value our hearing families, friends, co-workers. We are not living in a ghetto. And of course, we function in the hearing world, but we also value our relationships within the deaf community. Let's move on to white privilege in deaf education. If you look at the demographics of teachers of the deaf in Canada, they are almost exclusively white, middle-class women. Yet the children we teach are as diverse as any classroom: Black, Indigenous, new immigrants, etc. How do these teachers navigate the various family, cultures, backgrounds, languages, religious beliefs, traditions, cultures, identities, while coming from this position of white privilege? This is a big problem in deaf education. One can't help but notice that white privilege extends to those who control deaf education. Almost everyone is white. And who benefits the most from deaf education policies? The auditory industrial complex. The benefits go to those who sell hearing aids, to the health system that supports CIs, such as surgeons, audiologists, speech language pathologists, etc. Legions of mainly white people hold all these roles. So the main benefactors of current deaf educational systems and policies are white. The auditory industrial complex doesn't want much heed paid to sign language. They want to focus on CIs, hearing aids, therapists to their financial personal benefit. The communication continuum is quite wide. You have spoken English, the yellow column, on the one side, and American Sign Language, the blue column, on the other side. The pink columns illustrate the oralist approach. Total focus is on speech and hearing, using specialized services such as therapists and technologies such as CIs and amplification systems. Sign language would be forbidden. The middle brownish-orange columns, plus the green columns, fall under a general heading of total communication. Total communication is meant to use signing in English word order. Some systems have developed a sign to correspond with each spoken word. There seems to be some flexibility in the different codes, but the primary purpose is to illustrate English word order, grammar, using signs. It's like taking French vocabulary and putting it in English word order. The green columns seem to have more flexibility and will incorporate more ASL features and is less strict on demonstrating the word-for-word English syntax. As I mentioned, the blue column is American Sign Language. So each end of the continuum is bounded by a true language, English and ASL. In between the two are the various non-language codes used in deaf education. Now I want to explore language deprivation in more detail. How does language deprivation occur in deaf education? It begins with the assumption, the myth, that providing hearing aids or surgically inserting cochlear implants is the perfect solution for all deaf children. It might provide a benefit to some, that's true, and these children may thrive with speech and auditory training, so don't think I'm against these services. But the dominant thinking is that all we need to do is give them the technology and let them be on their way. But these hearing augmentation solutions do not correct hearing like eyeglasses can make one's vision crystal clear. Not even close. Much of the auditory information is still not perceived by the brain. So much is missed. For many children, their brains receive inadequate input, unable to piece together any semblance of a spoken language. It can't interpret the sounds to develop rules for syntax, grammar, meaning, morphology. For example, English word endings, crucial to meaning and grammar, are often missed. It's just a jumble of auditory sounds, inaudible, garbled sounds, and missing sounds. So the developing brain lacks the necessary input to make out that a language is even present. The same is true of a sign language. If the ASL language model is disfluent, then the deaf student's brain is not receiving input of the necessary features of a true language to develop naturally. In both these scenarios, the children are language deprived because their young developing brains are not given proper exposure to a true language. It's easy to see that the oralism approach is propagated and chosen for deaf children because of our audiocentric biases. Families want their deaf children to speak, to be part of the hearing family's culture. But the reality is that most children taught in a strictly oralist approach end up language deprived. Unfortunately, most doctors and therapists force families to choose one or the other, either the oral approach or the signing approach. It's always framed that the family and the deaf child can't have both, and the legacy is that deaf and hard of hearing children for many decades and even up to this very moment are language deprived. Let's look into some studies and find out what language deprivation looks like in deaf students. Research shows that deaf students in their early to mid-teens have the language of a 3 or 4 or maybe a 5-year-old. In my own case, when I went to grade 1, my language was that of a 3-year-old. So in grade 1, I talked like a 3-year-old. I was already coming in language deprived. Research has identified the phenomena of linguistic neglect. It's when the significant adults in the deaf child's life, the parents, teachers, audiologists, and so on, believe that once all the technological services have been put in place, that the student will develop normally, be able to speak and interact with hearing peers naturally. They believe the deaf child will be able to pick up languages as well as any other child if they are put in a mainstream environment. This rarely turns out the way the parents imagined. It's not that easy. Because they are working on the assumption the technology will make the child hearing, the adults neglect to see the child is not progressing, overlook the child's needs, do not recognize the child is not developing equal to peers. This is linguistic neglect. Our brains are uniquely wired to perceive language. Our brains do not care if it's a sign language or a spoken language. If it's exposed to language, the young developing brain will take in all that input and will learn the language and will learn to express meaning through steady exposure and constantly interpreting the grammar, vocabulary, and all the nuances of language input. Unfortunately, we have social, cultural, and linguistic prejudices against sign language, so we withhold them from deaf students. As a consequence of language deprivation, most high school graduates have a median reading level of grade 4, whether they come in from an oral or a signing education program. The study I am citing here is for the year 2000, but not much has changed in the intervening years. What we do find is that oral raised students with cochlear implants and signing non-implanted students achieve similar levels of word knowledge and world knowledge. Both groups have similar achievements, which actually means both groups struggle and show the effects of language deprivation. Regardless of educational programming, the general outcomes are the same. That's very telling. Don't forget that students using sign language are often being taught or provided interpretation by underqualified and disfluent language models. So how does language deprivation and lack of academic achievement impact deaf students? Obviously, their opportunities to attend post-secondary education is limited, which naturally impacts their employment prospects. I want to take some time to again revisit the medical versus cultural perspectives in deaf education. The medical perspective sees deaf people as disabled, handicapped, hearing impaired. Their condition is defined by deficit, deafness, deaf, hearing loss. From the medical point of view, the language problems experienced are the individual's fault. Language deficiencies are innate, due to brain dysfunctions. This view does not see any societal factors in the deaf person's problems or struggles to acquire language. The deaf child is simply not smart enough. The medical perspective defines the healthcare's role to medically help the deaf person hear, to address communication disorders by developing equipment, for example, to use a telephone, like the TDD. From them, it comes back to the mantra that the deaf have to function in the hearing world. Naturally, the best way to do that is through inclusive educational programming. The cultural perspective is very different. The deaf and hard of hearing view themselves through the lens of a cultural and linguistic minority. They identify as deaf or hard of hearing, not hearing impaired. Don't use that term. Or they may identify as big D deaf. Deaf people view themselves as a cultural minority that has rights as citizens and has a place in the community as deaf people, that American Sign Language is a true language, and that any debate to the contrary should be over by now. Deaf people perceive themselves as different. The fact that they sign instead of speak does not make them inferior, it makes them different. The traditional equipment to use the telephone in the community was the TTY, which is now obsolete, as is the TDD. Now we just use text or video calls. The community values deaf schools as part of the culture, historical and current. It supports bilingual, bicultural education programming. No binaries, no either or, both English, spoken and written, and signing are valued. So you can see how different the two perspectives are. Let's explore more deeply the nuanced definition of language. There is actually a lot of new research in the area. What we know is that language does not pre-exist in the brain. It's not a matter of turning it on and out it comes. Language is socially constructed by a group of people engaged in meaning making. This is a relatively new perspective on language acquisition, and it hasn't made its way into deaf education yet. Not really. In other studies of language use, they found that each of us has language repertoires that are partial and unbounded. To this day, my English skills continue to develop. It's not like I've learned everything there is to know about English. The same is true for my fluency in ASL. I still continue to learn more about the language, and it's fascinating. The same is true for all of us. We each have differing skills in language or languages we use, and continue to expand those repertoires, which of course is very good. The research shows we use multiple semiotic resources in our language making. It's not limited to speaking or signing. We incorporate other resources in our language development. Examples include signs, symbols, objects, persons, sound, vision, contexts, and so on. All these resources come into play in our language building and meaning making. Language and cognition are not strictly in our brains, but are distributed across multiple environments, which serves to explain our understanding of language and how it is stimulated by traveling to different environments. We need to introduce the concept of intercultural relationships in deaf education. This has not really been addressed in the past. Typically, classroom exploration of other cultures has been superficial, such as discussing ethnic foods, traditional dancing, holidays observed, clothing, or maybe even learn a greeting or two in another language. Teachers now need to look at cultures at a much deeper level to really try to understand a culture by considering beliefs and historical contexts in order to explore the concepts of intercultural relationships. This exploration needs to touch on the inner attitudes, behaviors, and mores that shape a person's worldview. We need to recognize which side of the line we're on. On one side of the line is the other, with their lived experience, different from our own, a different culture, a different economic context. Here in North America, we are rich, have plenty of natural resources. We have power, which can be quite different than those on the other side of the abyssal line. It's unlikely we will truly understand the world from their point of view. Having said that, we need to develop the ability to imagine life in the other's shoes and attempt to come closer, to dialogue, to interact toward an understanding of what can be built together. Not just what I know, not just what they know, but what can we build together, what it might be. It is surely something novel, never imagined before. Our own study of intercultural relations can help us teach deaf children, can help us guide them through the many transitions of identities they may experience through the maturation process. The more exposure the deaf child has to different positive social experiences, the better for their development. The child should not be plunked into a hearing classroom and assume they'll be able to pick up on everything that's going on around them. We cannot inflict this daily frustration on them. Communication will grow and change through time. Students' needs will naturally change. It could be that early on after the CI implantation, the student saw great gains. 2 years later, the student may need much more support. Often teachers, therapists, or administrators assume that if a child is at grade level, then supports are no longer needed and they are withdrawn. This can be when language deprivation begins to increase, and it will only worsen over time. The deaf child's connection to community will also change with age. In the earlier years, connection to family may be sufficient. Then their social group expands to include friends, more adults. All children need a meaningful community, and its composition will and should evolve over time. How can we avoid making errors in judgment, program decisions, and so on? The key is to recognize the need to be highly self-aware. Any service provider or educator needs to be reflective. Consider your internal biases. Consider your privilege, because your authentic attitudes can never be suppressed or hidden. So let's name the top 10 teaching mistakes in deaf education. This assumption is all too common to teachers of the deaf. Assuming that since the child is wearing a hearing aid or is implanted, and the teacher is wearing her amplification device, therefore the child hears everything. This is false. The school routines help a child to know what's going on, but the novel information, such as introducing new concepts, technical vocabulary for a particular subject, those can be the precise situations when the child does not understand what is being said. Another common mistake for teachers is speaking too quickly. Or, alternatively, they think speaking more loudly helps, which it doesn't. Remember, 30% of the sounds we make are visible on the face and lips. That leaves a lot of content indistinguishable. It's not an effective strategy. Teachers assume that in the event there is no interpreter, or perhaps the FN system is malfunctioning, that giving the deaf student the textbook to read or other material to review is an adequate substitute. I'm here to tell you that deaf students and deaf adults struggle to understand most reading material. Asking a student to learn independently by reading materials is often counterproductive. It's particularly counterproductive if they are language deprived. It's not uncommon for hearing teachers, psychologists, and other professionals to conclude that a deaf child has an intellectual disability. Often what they are seeing are the effects of language deprivation. They see the child as struggling to understand concepts, struggles with reading and writing, their thinking processes are delayed or underdeveloped. These observations are automatically linked to intellectual challenges. Another mistake that teachers make is to dismiss the interpreter in order to communicate with the student directly. The goal is to form a bond, which is good, but not if you expect the student to speech read you or to struggle to understand your meager signs. Students and deaf people are good at pretending to understand you, to nod, to save face, and agree as you say whatever you say, which they are likely not understanding. You come away feeling gratified, but does the student? Now you've set up a dynamic that puts increased pressure on the student to be able to understand you without the interpreter. Keep in mind that whenever teaching advanced concepts or vocabulary, interpreting services should always be provided. Signing for yourself and having a relationship with the student is great, but ASL is a language, so a competent interpreter will be needed for you to deliver your lessons to your student. Often hearing adults underestimate how visually aware deaf students are. Having conversations in spoken English with others that effectively leaves the child out does not go unnoticed. They feel excluded, isolated, and unimportant. Deaf adults who use ASL are deeply offended when others speak in front of them, which intentionally excludes them. It demonstrates perfectly an attitude of audiocentric privilege. Many teachers assume that all families have effective communication with their deaf children. If only that was true. I have known teachers who believe that with their own basic signing skills, maybe they have taken a course or two, they can convey complex ideas to students. It's not true. I've had numerous teachers tell me that they have had a deaf child in their class before, so I know what I'm doing. Oh my goodness, if that could only be true. Each child comes with their own histories. No two are the same. Consider the variety of factors and skills: language, English and/or ASL, language function, social emotional development, hearing levels, to name a few. What are the child's community connections? What are the relationships like in the family unit? No two students are the same, so what was done last time may not meet the needs of the student in front of you. Another mistake I see is that teachers assume that the families know everything about their deaf child. I have also seen the opposite, the assumption that families know nothing about their deaf child. Often the truth of the matter lies somewhere in the middle. There we are. Thank you for your time.